Welcome to the Intentional Encourager podcast, where each episode brings you compelling conversations and stories designed to entertain, enlighten, and encourage. And now here's your host, Brian Sexton.
Hey everybody, Brian Sexton. I am intentionally encouraged when I see people doing business the right way. And for the last 15 years, Damon Burton and his team at SEO National have done just that. Now you might say, Brian, what can they do for me in my business? I'm going to tell you what they can do for you. They can help you understand search engine optimization. There are a lot of players out there in the marketplace, but you want a team of people that are going to be dedicated to working with you and helping you to understand search engine optimization and how you can show up higher on search engines so that you can bring more revenue into your business. Damon and his team are full of integrity, honesty, decency, and trust. And if that's important to you and that encourages you, I would encourage you to give them a call today at 855-736-6285 or go to SEOnational.com and get a free quote and tell them you heard about it on the Intentional Encourager podcast. Get ready for a dynamite conversation coming up right now on the Intentional Encourager podcast. And welcome into the Intentional Encourager podcast. I'm your host, Brian Sexton. Thank you for joining us again today. Man, I've got another podcaster with me today, and I love it when I get other podcasters on with me. I was privileged to be on Tony's podcast, and again, I want you to go check it out. He's going to tell you all about where you can find his podcast. We're just going to dive deep into some great conversation, and I want to bring my friend Tony Swisher to the Intentional Encourager podcast. Tony, what's good? How you doing?
I'm doing all right, Brian. Thank you for having me on. So my podcast that I'm doing is called The Gospel Effect, which is all about sharing testimonies that kind of embody the quote from The Chosen. I don't know if you're familiar with that series, but there's a scene where Mary talks about, I was one way and now I'm completely different. And the thing that happened in the middle was him. And that's kind of like what the podcast is meant to embody, which that'll be available Tuesday, October 4th is when the first episode drops. So it'll probably be after the release of this episode. But that'll be available on the Church Keeler Ministries YouTube to start. And then it'll also be available on anchor.fm on Saturdays.
And we'll drop those links to the podcast in with the show notes of this podcast. So you want to go back and you want to find Tony's podcast. What a great honor it was for me to be on Tony's podcast. Let's start here, Tony. You were talking about the Gospel Effect podcast that you started. Give me kind of the sense. This is a generic question because a lot of people go, well, how'd you get started podcasting? I don't want to know that. I want to know when that moment, that V8 moment was that, oh, man, I should podcast. Because for me, I wrestled with it for probably a year or so before I got started. What was that aha moment for you of I'm diving in and I'm going to do a podcast?
So it actually started mid-pandemic, believe it or not. It was 2020. I'm working a full-time job, but due to the pandemic, they scaled back the hours, even though it was a necessary business, which due to security concerns, I can't quite go into that. But anyway, I had free time in the morning, so I just took it to the Lord, and podcasting was on my heart. He gave me the idea for a podcast that's sharing testimonies that eventually died out because my work schedule picked back up. And, but then this past June, I left that job, and like the Lord is moving our church into a more media centered outreach, as well as like boots on the ground outreach. But with that, the pastor's like, hey, I think you should reboot that podcast you were doing. So get me a name and stuff. And I prayed about it, and I'm like, and then it was like, boom, Gospel Effect. And like, because I live in the Great Lakes region,
Yeah.
And so we talk about like lake effect snow and stuff like that. And so it just had this like great ring to it. But it started like with COVID-19, which is kind of interesting to say the least.
Well, and that's how I got started podcasting. I was able to take the time, Tony, that I had some extra time, and the pandemic was a perfect vehicle for that. And I love the word effect in there, because I don't think we, and again, folks, I'm not trying to tailor this particular podcast to Christians or non-Christians. Listen, but things have an effect on people, whether you're a believer or not, whether you're a Christian or not. Things in our lives have effects on us. So what effect has your podcast had on you, Tony?
Well, it's actually helped me grow a little bit. I've heard so many interesting stories that are outside of the echo chamber of where I live. Like when I first started the podcast, back in 2020, I had interviewed someone who actually was involved in a vehicle accident with a motorcycle. It was deemed this person's fault, and the motorcyclist died.
Wow.
And
wow.
Yeah. And so, like, I got to hear her testimony of how she went through that grief. And it was just like powerful. And I'm like, wow, my experience has been way different.
Yeah.
But I've also learned that it doesn't discount my experience either.
No, that's, you know what, that's a beautiful point that you made is everybody in life has had experiences that have gone one way or the other. And again, I know you've listened to this podcast. You understand that the purpose of this podcast is to tell those stories of things that people have overcome, those great things that people have overcome. But you don't have to have overcome something devastating to have overcome something devastating. And I say that in a double entendre, because what might be devastating to you might not be devastating to me, and vice versa. And I love that you said there. Has there been anything that has surprised you so far in podcasting? Something that you go, man, I didn't expect that from podcasting.
Well, yes and no. So no, because I did some research prior, but yes, because like, especially recently when I left my work in June, the structure that I had due to having to get up at a specific time and go to work kind of went away. And I'm like still learning to restructure my life in these months following. And like podcasting and like having to schedule interviews and stuff like that has helped me grow in that as well.
I love that. And it is a challenge. There are a lot of times, and again, that's why for me, I had to become more portable in my podcasting, because I'm in hotel rooms 2 or 3 nights a week, or a certain amount of times per month. I'm in hotel rooms, and I don't have the perfect setup all the time. As my camera is flashing right now, sometimes you don't always have the perfect setup. Sometimes you don't always have everything that you need or want, but you do the best that you can do. When you think about structure, and I love that, learning how to restructure your life, what was the biggest opportunity that came from the restructure of going back to something familiar for you?
Well, it's just allowed me to focus more on what's important and think about, like, when I left my job, it was to start my business. And like part of that was so I had more time with my wife, because I was working 50, 60 hours a week for the last 6 years. And I had missed out on like spending my wife's birthday with her for the last 6 years, because our anniversary and birthday and her birthday are a week apart. And so I had to pick one week or the other, which sucked. And so like this year was the first year I was able to spend on her birthday with my wife.
Hey everybody, Brian Sexton. Prices are going up by the day. We've got to find ways to increase our household revenue. Now, a couple ways you could do that is, one, you could go and ask your boss for a raise. But if that doesn't work, I've got another way for you. It's my friend Joe Hart's program called Products for Profit. Joe's been a guest here on the Intentional Encourager podcast and told his story about how learning retail arbitrage changed his life, and he's been helping thousands of people change theirs. Now, retail arbitrage is simply this. It's taking a product and buying it and then reselling it online for a higher price, and you keep the profits. And guess what? Amazon and Walmart use third-party resellers every day to fulfill their customer orders. I want you to go to productsforprofit.com or productsforprofit.card.co. Get connected to Joe's team. Tell them you heard about it on the Intentional Encourager podcast and start making money today with Products for Profit. And now let's get back to more great conversation on the Intentional Encourager podcast. Man, that's awesome. That's awesome. So take me through, was there some fear? Was there some trepidation? Because here's why I asked that, Tony. I asked that because I think a lot of people look at and I'm going to use this word, and forgive me if I've offended somebody with this word. A lot of people look at being an entrepreneur as being sexy, kind of looking at it like, oh, I'm going to, as the kids would say, make bank. I'm going to just set the world on fire. And a lot of times you're working more than anybody else is in the business. You're sacrificing a lot. It's entirely about what you can produce with your hands or your mind or whatever, however it is that you produce the goods and services that you have. It's all on you. Was there something you learned about yourself in starting your business?
Well, I learned I'm not nearly as organized as I thought I was.
I think that's 100% everybody,
yeah.
Man.
That was the biggest thing. And just like the challenges of like getting all the appropriate tax stuff set up and just the legal aspect of everything. And it was daunting, but I also learned that there's a certain freedom that comes with it. And like the last couple of weeks of my job, I was on cloud 9. Like, if we're being honest, because I'm like, yes, I'm finally getting out of here. And not having this essentially, and me being who I am, it's probably going to offend some people, but not having like a slave mentality in my workplace. And I realized in those last 2 weeks that I chose to have that mentality while at work, and I could have not had that mentality, if that makes sense.
No, Tony, I think it makes perfect sense, because you can feel like, okay, so let's use a biblical perspective here. The Bible says that the borrower is servant to the lender. And it's from Proverbs. And you can at times feel like, I don't have a choice. I have to do this. I don't have a choice. I have to do that. I don't have a choice here. I don't have a choice there. You can almost feel like you're in bondage to your career, to your company, almost like you're being indebted to them for what you have. And it's like, well, how are we going to pay the bills if I don't, I'm going to throw my West Virginia. If I don't work, we don't eat. We can't pay the bills if I don't work. Got to go out here and make the money. And I think a lot of times, Tony, I believe a lot of times people put themselves in those positions because it's the repos. It's the relentless pursuit of stuff that gets people in that situation where it's like, well, I ain't got a choice. I got to go out here and work. I mean, everybody's got to go work. Got to pay your taxes. Got to go work till you die. And I don't think it is that way. You were talking about finding your freedom. How empowering was it the first day that you were actually working for yourself?
Oh my goodness. It was like super empowering. So I'm like, oh, I don't have to do X, Y, and Z. Like, oh, hey, this needs to be done. Okay, I should do it. Versus like having a boss, it's like, hey, here's the expectation, here's the unrealistic time frame, get it done. If that makes sense.
No, I think it makes perfect sense because you're the boss, you're setting the time frame, you understand the commitment that you made to your customer, you understand what you have to produce in revenue to make a living, or at least replace what you left. Now, I think it makes perfect sense. And here's what I would say. It's never been an easier time to be an entrepreneur, but I would also say not everybody's cut out to be an entrepreneur. You know, and so it's not as – I was talking to my 22-year-old son one day, and he was talking about – this was several years ago. He was talking about being a YouTuber and how it's like, man, these guys are making money and things like that. And I think to myself, if that's what you're going to do for a career, at some point you're gonna be passed by somebody younger with something different and things like that. And I look and I say, I don't know how sustainable it is. When you look at entrepreneurship, let me ask you this. What's your biggest piece of intentional encouragement for somebody that is watching us, this podcast on YouTube, and they're saying, man, Brian, Tony, I would love nothing more than to start my own business. I've got an idea. I would like to do this or that, but I'm feeling that trepidation. I'm feeling that nervousness, that anxiousness. Tony, what's your biggest piece of intentional encouragement for those folks out there like that?
So in case your listeners haven't caught on, I am a Christian. And so I'm going to start with a story. And this is a story that prompted me to do what I was doing. So I was reading in the Gospels, and there's a story in there of the disciples in a boat. And it's night, it's storming, the boat's rocking all over the place. So, and the boat is their only safety net. And then they see this figure walking on the water. And it's Jesus, and Peter is in the boat, one of the apostles, and he calls out to Jesus. He's like, Jesus, if that's you, and this is my paraphrase of it, if that's really you, call me out onto the water so I can walk on the water with you. And Jesus is like, come on. And Peter jumps out of the boat and starts walking on the water. But then once he started focusing on the storm, instead of like having the faith that God's got him and that he was called out onto the water, he started to sink. And so, like, in that moment when I was reading that, the Lord spoke to me. He's like, do you have the faith to step out of the boat? Because everyone dogs Peter like, oh, he lost faith because he took his eyes off Jesus. No, he lost faith because he started focusing on the storm around him. And so when you take that leap, it's not going to be easy, and it will be a step of faith, but don't focus on the storms.
I love that. Don't focus on the storms. Because, Tony, here's the thing that I will say, and I love what you said there. When people understand at times, and I think the pandemic did this to some degree. What the pandemic did was it said, this is too big for us. This is too big for me. This is too big. We've got to, and again, not trying to get political or hear things like that, but it's like we never masked up when people had the flu. We never masked up when people had whatever. We just dealt with it. And all of a sudden, we had that fearful mentality of, oh my gosh, the boat's rocking and Jesus is asleep. We're going to die. It just felt like COVID had that same kind of spirit of fear about it, where people just said, we're going to die. I can't understand this. We're going to die. I love what you said there about the storms. Don't focus on the storms. For you, how was your faith either encouraged or tested or both in that midst of, because you mentioned the transition between leaving your old job and starting your business. Take me through that time period of when you made the decision that you were just going to go for it and start your business.
So it was back in early June. Like, I had been having that like nagging feeling like, hey, I don't belong here anymore. I've overstayed my welcome here at this job. Like, I need to get out. Yeah. But there was no like other job that interested me, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, well, I've got this equipment and it's something that I have done. So for those of you who don't know, before I continue, my business is called Shine Event Services. Pretty much we do like DJing. We partner with a photographer to get you a photographer for any sort of event, corporate videos, stuff like that.
You got a great setup there too, by the way, man.
Yes, thank you.
Great setup.
That was lots of learning that took that.
So, I think we both can speak to the learning part.
Yeah.
And Tony, I don't mean to interrupt you, but that's a beautiful point that you make there. I don't think that too many people, I shouldn't say I don't think, I don't believe too many people process the educational part of starting their business or starting their podcast. Because I've always said to people, I said, look, I bought equipment that I don't even use anymore. You know, I had to go buy a mixer and all of this, that. And I think to myself, I should have just bought a really kick-butt USB microphone and a really kick-butt camera. Kind of what I've got now, the setup I've got now. I've got a great 1080p camera, and I've got a great microphone that didn't cost me an arm and a leg. My microphone is and not getting compensated or anything, although if they want to sponsor the Intentional Encourager podcast,
right?
I'd be down for it. But I have a Samson Q2U microphone that has an XLR and a USB component. I wish I had done a little bit more homework. When you are transitioning and going to that, how much research, how much work and effort did you put into researching the things that you would need to have or do to be successful? Because you mentioned earlier not knowing the legal part of it, and I think that trips everybody up. But what about the technical part, the equipment, things like that?
So as far as like the audio goes, I'm actually the sound guy at my church. And so I kind of had that down. But the area that I struggled with was video and lighting, because we had a more traditional-ish setup when live streaming our church. It was like single camera, regular house lights. So it didn't look good, but like it took a little bit of research, like even to get this look. Like 2 years ago, you wouldn't have seen this look, but because I started my business and invested in like uplighting for DJ stuff, and then I had to like look into that, like how to light a venue or things of that sort, and I'm still learning. But you take what you know and get started, because if you wait until you know enough to where you think you can get started, you're never going to start. I promise you.
Hey everybody, Brian Sexton. You know, dreams are powerful pieces of intentional encouragement. We all have them. If you're a business owner, you've probably always dreamed of taking your sales to levels you've never seen before. I've got a guy that can help you with that. His name is Brad Norwood. My good buddy Brad has been on the Intentional Encourager podcast as a guest before, and he is a dream specialist. His company, Dream It Pro, offers incentive packages to travel to places such as the Masters, Kentucky Derby, the Super Bowl, even exotic places that you've always wanted to take your team, but you just didn't know how to do it. Brad's your guy. And oh, by the way, Brad's a certified bucket list coach, so he can help your team members achieve their personal dreams as well. I want you to go to www.dreamitpro.com and find out more, or call him directly at 479-466-6907. And by the way, tell him you heard it on the Intentional Encourager podcast. Let's get back to more great conversation here on the Intentional Encourager podcast. Well, for me, it was Googling how to turn on a light switch.
Yes.
You know, how to plug in a light bulb. You know, I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer, so to speak. But no, and you know, our sound guy at church, who's the technical advisor to this podcast, he told me, he said, there's a lot of things that I learned on the internet.
Yes.
I learned a lot of things about how to do and what to do and how to do it and things like that. And if there's somebody listening to our podcast and they're going, you know, I want to do what you guys do and things like that, I want to podcast. It seems like everybody wants to podcast now.
Yeah.
I would tell you it's not as hard as you're making it.
No.
But you're going to have to figure some things out.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you're going to have to learn how. And again, I've got a nice little portable mixer. I never use it because I wanted things. For me, my biggest lesson was make it as portable as possible. Be able to podcast anywhere that you are. And so you and I were talking before we started recording about the setup that I have, and it's all portable. It's completely portable. For you, when you think about your business, where do you see your business going in the next year? And what's the biggest, if you could have, let me ask it this way. What would Tony now, if you could sit down with a cup of coffee whenever you started your business several months ago, if you could go back October, Tony Swisher, and sit down with Tony Swisher getting ready to start his business, what's your biggest piece of encouragement you'd have for yourself?
To go all in and not be too concerned with what other people think. Because when I left my job, for example, there were a lot of negative Nancy's that, because I had found an aspect of freedom in my life, they didn't like it because they didn't have that freedom. And it doesn't matter what you're doing. When you find freedom, people who are not free are going to resent you for it.
Man, I love that. What happens when you find freedom? What happens when you find that thing you're supposed to do? What happens when you find that powerful thing that you're intended to do? Man, I love that. And that's what I'm writing down. What happens when we find freedom? It's an incredible. And here's what makes me think about that, Tony. I grew up in a little town in Ohio that, and I'll have to get my friend on that's the historian of our small little town. The little town that I grew up in, Tony, was settled by freed slaves. They swam across the Ohio River from then Virginia, which was a slave state, into Ohio, which was a free state. And they were free, and there they settled the little town that I grew up in. And it's amazing what people will do for freedom.
Yes, but like in that respect, though, like when you look at America's history, and as dark and tragic as it is, unfortunately, the bound mindset or the slave mindset, it always starts up here. Like, you can't be free physically until you get some sort of freedom mentally.
I love that. It's basically conquering the battles of the mind.
Yes.
It is understanding and encourage. Listen, what you just hit on is we need to encourage ourselves to go forward. We encourage ourselves to take that, and it's not a pep talk. I don't think people understand. You got to have way more than a pep talk with yourself to start your own business or to take that leap of faith and go out there. Tony, I would ask you this as we wrap up this episode. We're going to have a second part I want you to dive into your story on. Give the folks your biggest piece of intentional encouragement. Anywhere you want to take it, just take it and go.
Just my biggest piece of intentional encouragement is don't be afraid to step out of the boat, even if it's storming.
Say that again, please, if you don't mind.
Said, don't be afraid to step out of the boat, even if it's storming.
Don't be afraid to step out of the boat, even if it's storming. Wow. And if you're watching on YouTube, it kind of looks like it's storming with the background here. But, Tony, man, this has been powerful. You have given us so much to think about. Tell folks again where they can find your podcast, the Gospel Effect Podcast, and how can they connect with you on social, by the way, as well, too.
All right. So as far as the Gospel Effect Podcast, it's on YouTube at the Church Keeler Ministries. And then search for Gospel Effect on Anchor. And I'm currently working to get that available on other podcasting platforms as well. And then also Facebook, you can look up the Church Keeler, get a hold of anyone at the church, or just search Tony Swisher from the Dowagiac area. That'll be me. Otherwise, if you want to book a business or book the business, it's shineeventservices.weebly.com. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
shineeventservices.weebly.com.
Yes.
WEEBLY or LEY?
LY.
LY. Shine Event Services at Weebly.com. And my man, Tony Swisher, this was great conversation, Tony. Can't wait to spend more time with you. And I appreciate you joining me on this episode of the Intentional Encourager Podcast. My thanks as always to producer Bryce Sexton and technical advisor Matt Means. And of course, the ultimate thanks goes to the Lord Jesus Christ, who provides intentional encouragement every day through his word. If you're not subscribed to the Intentional Encourager podcast, hit the subscribe button wherever you get podcasts so you don't miss an exciting episode where you can get encouraged and stay encouraged. And remember, anyone, anywhere, at any time, any place can be an intentional encourager.